Hello everyone and welcome to the National Environmental Science Program Climate Systems Hub webinar, Understanding Future Climate Risk Co-Design Applications for Local Decision Making. My name is Ramona Della Pozza and I'm a knowledge broker with the Climate Systems Hub, working from the University of Tasmania. Today I'll be sharing insights from a University of Tasmania project that I have led with my UTAS and Hub colleague, Associate Professor Sarah Bolter, on behalf of the rest of the team at UTAS, Project Manager Tim Boyle, Dr. Nick Earl Jones, Lucy Wesson, and Dr. Kathleen Bayer. We also had help from a project advisory group that included members of our project partners, as well as the Australian Department of Climate Change, Energy, the Environment and Water. The project was funded by the National Emergency Management Agency Disaster Reduction Package, and this funding enabled us to have 4 co-designed case studies applying climate projections and information for local decision making. So today I'm excited to share the findings of this work, and we'll hear directly from our project partners. But before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people, who are the traditional custodians of Melbourne, where I'm joining from today, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. And I'd also like to extend my respects to all First Nations people joining us today. The Climate Systems Hub recognises the important role traditional knowledge plays in understanding Australia's climate. A few things to note before we begin. This webinar is being recorded. The link is available. The link will be available on the NESP Climate Systems Hub website. We encourage you to ask questions throughout the presentation, and thank you to those who have already sent in your questions. Please type your questions into the Q&A function at any time, and also say who your question is directed to, because we will wait till the end after all the speakers have presented to answer the questions. If this is your first Climate Systems Hub webinar, welcome. We've had a great range of presentations this year, and today is going to be another one. So I'll get started with a brief overview of our project before handing over to our project partners. Today, you'll hear from 3 of the 4 case study partners as they describe how the narrative scenarios were co-designed and co-produced with their stakeholders. We also came together as a group at the end of the project to compare the case studies and identify common processes and provide some recommendations. As mentioned, this work was funded through NEMA's Disaster Risk Reduction Package, and the objective of the project was to use co-designed approaches to strengthen decision-making by combining climate information with local knowledge. We've heard from our project partners that they were concerned about the risks of increasing frequency and intensity of compound events. For example, a drought followed by a bushfire and then a heavy downpour can lead to contaminated water supplies and damage to ecosystems. In this way, these compounding events actually amplify the impacts. And traditional risk assessments often focus on single hazards, which can lead to underestimating the true risks. The diversity of our case studies in this project is a strength. And you'll see in this diagram the comparison of how they differed in scale of organisation, target audience, and decision-making approach. In the ACT, you'll hear how they worked across government departments and across interconnected systems. In the Glenelg Hopkins Catchment Management Authority in Victoria, they worked with Parks Victoria to explore ecological resilience and test conservation action plans. And in the Huon Valley in Tasmania, they worked directly with the public and the council through a local livability framework that used storytelling approaches. We've also had additional insights from a consultancy, Inform.City, where they use structured scenarios for climate-related financial disclosures that were developed for executives and board members. We won't be diving into this one today, but you can read all about it in our report. Through this project, we found that scenarios need to be tailored to an organisational context, government structures, and decision-making cultures. The scenarios varied in structure, timeframes, intended use, and this reflected the flexibility of these narrative approaches. Across all the 4 case studies, we found the greatest value in the approach not only lay in the production of the scenarios themselves, but actually in the participatory process that generated them. The insights have helped us to develop a 5-stage process for co-designing narrative scenarios, along with some key development principles that can be applied more broadly. When you look at the process, firstly, we need to understand the local context. And this involved working with stakeholders to discuss their lived experiences, identify past climate-related hazards that really put the impacts into their local context. Then we used participatory methods to develop plausible futures and structured narrative scenarios. The 4th step is really important because to make scenarios actionable, they need to be integrated into existing strategic frameworks, planning and policy. This framework is similar to other co-design approaches that we've used in the Hub, and it's adaptable and can be, and depending on the organisational needs, can be used in different ways. Through the collective experience of our project partners, we also came up with some recommendations to help those organisations like NEMA who support disaster preparedness and adaptation planning at a local scale. And we heard that what was key to success was empowering local leadership to ensure that scenario development is led by the local organisations that will use the outputs. It was also helpful to have knowledge brokers to translate the climate information to what it means for their local context. And it was recognised that developing the scenarios actually helps to build the organisational capacity and through training and providing tools and frameworks. Importantly, scenario development was just the start of the process, and that scenarios should be integrated into ongoing monitoring and evaluation. And as mentioned earlier, the greatest value of this approach was in the participatory process and how involving the stakeholders. So we will hear more about that now through the descriptions from our project partners. And I would now like to introduce Shering Yangzong, Assistant Director of Adaptation and Resilient Policy in the ACT Government, to tell you about the work that she did with her stakeholders. Over to you, Shering.
Thank you, Ramona. Yuma, everyone. I'm joining from Ngunnawal country in Canberra, representing the ACT government. And for the next 7 minutes, I'll take you through the climate narrative scenarios journey in the ACT. Next slide, please. So the purpose of this project is to improve climate risk awareness by framing the impacts of climate hazards through a narrative-based approach. And in the ACT, we looked at compounding and cascading risks from heat waves, bushfire, and smoke. And the reason why these hazards were chosen was because of the significant historical significance in which it had significant negative impacts across the ACT, and their potential to produce compounding and cascading impacts. By integrating the climate science, climate projection data together with historical insights, both quantitative and qualitative, including our participants' lived experiences, the project fosters innovative and inclusive approaches to climate adaptation. And through this project, we were able to develop two hypothetical yet plausible scenarios across these three different time frame: the near term, mid century, and end century. A third scenario is still under development, which I'll talk a bit more later. Next slide, please. And just to clarify that these scenarios are hypothetical yet plausible scenarios, and it's not predictions. And we developed the scenarios purely for internal use of the ACT government to strengthen our capacity to anticipate and respond to climate-related challenges, and also to guide climate adaptation. And our scenarios are based on the corner possibility foresight model, where we are looking at plausible scenarios. And while the scenarios are for the ACT government use, it was co-designed with key stakeholders across the government, but we also identified some key external stakeholders to inform our scenario development, and they were selected based on their critical expertise and their influence across key systems in the ACT. They include utility providers, energy, waste, and water providers, the members of the ACT Climate Change Council, which provides advice to our minister with regard to emission reduction and adaptation. We also had representatives from ACT Council of Social Services, which is the big body for community sector organizations. And we had academics from the ANU and University of Canberra. And throughout this project, we used a systems thinking approach across this project to map interdependencies between climate hazards, social systems, and institutional responses. And we were able to map 7 key systems in the ACT, which include built environment, looking at housing infrastructure, urban design, natural environments such as ecosystem, land use, and biodiversity, utilities, energy, waste, and water, telecommunication, emergency response, health, community and cultural heritage, recognizing the social fabric, cultural assets, and community resilience. And, by being able to map interdependencies, we were able to identify our shared vulnerabilities, and that gives us the opportunity for more integrated adaptation planning. Next slide, please. So this is just a background on our climate narrative scenario, but for the purpose of today's webinar, I'll take you through key insights that we have learned through our journey on this initiative. The first and the most powerful insight we learned was of seeing how narratives can, deepen understanding of climate data. Our participants are connected more with climate science when that's paired with historical insights. For example, looking at the 2003 bushfire, the 2019 and 2020 black summer bushfire in the ACT. So these historical events, it helped ground abstract data into real world impact, making risks more tangible and personal. And our scenario development was informed by climate projection data, as well as insights from historical events, both quantitative, looking at past occurrences of those hazards and their impact, and also quantitative, including participants' lived experiences through those events. So the scenarios that we developed were very rich, locally relevant, highlighting complexity, uncertainty, compounding and cascading risks facing the ACT. And our scenarios are all based on high emission pathway. Next slide, please. The next one is, gamification as a catalyst for informed imagination. So in order to spark creativity and to deepen our engagement, we introduce games to help build the scenarios. And again, we did not build the scenarios for our participants. We co-designed the scenarios with our participants, and we provided randomized climate cards. For example, on the left hand side of the screen, you can see that um, we had randomized climate cards based on climate projection information. And we also provided participants or groups with shock cards, which would look at other drivers of change, for example, environmental, technological, social. And we also introduced wildcards just to introduce events like the pandemic or cyber attacks. And these were done to introduce our participants to compounding and cascading impacts. And that really helped, us participants to visualize system-wide disruptions and also test our resilience. And for this project, we had 5 major stakeholder engagements, including 3 co-design workshops. Next slide. And the last one is diverse stakeholder contributes to inform imagination. So um, we we had, because it was whole of government approach, we had key stakeholders across the government, and that was very useful because our participants found it very challenging to relate to the end of the century scenario. It's very hard to imagine what life could look like at the end of the century. So, because we had all the subject matter experts in the room, we were able to, clarify assumptions, define our boundaries, and we also did a lot of trend analysis in the background. And so that really helped ground our scenarios. It's relevant based on local context. And in addition, excuse me, in addition to the climate projection data, we also used other informations like looking at the population trend. We also looked at the future of energy in the EACT to help ground our scenarios. The third scenario, again, recognizing the disproportionate impact of climate change on our First Nations people, and more importantly, to embed, indigenous knowledge into climate adaptation. Our third scenario is focused on looking at First Nations culture and leadership taking significant role in terms of community resilience after a major climate disaster. And that scenario is still under development and it's following a separate process. That's it from my side. Over to you, Ramona. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Shireen. It's great to hear about how your innovative approach helped to bring the government departments together in the ACT. I'd now like to welcome Marty Gent, who's the Biodiversity and Indigenous Partnerships Manager from the Glenelg Hopkins Catchment Management Authority in Southwest Victoria. Thanks, Marty.
Just pressing all the buttons. Thanks, Ramona. I'm joining you from Gonichmar country today, and from one of the 54 regional NRM groups from across Australia. In Victoria, we're called Catchment Management Authorities, and Glenelg Hopkins is in the southwest corner. That includes the coast and the border to South Australia, just to give you a bit of an idea of, so you can imagine where I am. And we have the southern bit of the beautiful Grampians, which you can see behind me. And I really want to start today by just saying a huge thank you to all the people involved in this project. The CMAs were given some federal funding to write climate change plans back in 2016, and since then we've had very little funding or support to do work on climate change. So this project, although small, has been incredibly important to us. Okay. Yeah, okay. So with limited time, I just wanted to focus on 3 of the steps that Ramona mentioned: setting the local context, co-designing the scenarios, and integrating them into existing strategies. One of the ways we looked at the local context was to go back and map historical events for our region, and this will make more sense when I show you the next step, because we've used this consistent pattern. But in fact, we didn't do it digitally like this. We used coloured bits of paper on the wall, which was a great sort of fun way of getting people up and about as well, sticking those bits of coloured paper to the windows. And this is such an important step in the process because it really allowed us to have a think about what events we've already had in the region. And as you can see, it pretty clearly indicates that there's been an increase in frequency and intensity of those events. And so brought up a lot of questions about the compounding and cascading impacts of those events happening together. And it also gave us context for the future scenarios, which on occasion look like they might be a bit crazy. But then when you look back at what we've already experienced, it makes them seem far more reasonable. So, okay. Oh, okay. So in the co-design, the next step of our workshop was to co-design our future scenarios together. And like Sering, we used a game to do that. So we created the climate wheel of misfortune, which includes the jar of despair and the dice of something I haven't made up yet. So the dice of making everything worse, I think, is probably what they are. So essentially, in groups, we spun the wheel for every year. And then depending on what we landed on, the duration was generated by rolling the dice, like how long a drought would last, or how long or how hot and long a heat wave would be. And then if you landed on a question mark, you might find yourself facing another sort of event along the lines of ecological collapse or a landslide or some other terrible thing. So it was a very sort of fun and high energy way of creating a scenario that brought in the random nature of things, even though the subject matter and the scenarios themselves ended up being or could be quite depressing. So once we'd spun the wheel, there's a few other ways of making sure that testing that these scenarios are appropriate, and then we did write up a little narrative about each one. But for more information about that, please feel free to get in contact. I'm more than happy to share that process with anybody who is interested. But essentially, we yes, and the top photo on the right there, you can see the sticky bits of coloured paper. So we extended out that past events map, for lack of a better word, into 4 different futures and developed our scenarios from there. So we have digitised those in the next slide. And as you can see, we then gave them fun names like scarily plausible and series of unfortunate events. So that was part of getting people to have a look at these scenarios and have a think about what they might mean and develop some narrative around them, which I think is a really essential part of developing scenarios for this kind of purpose. And for our project, we were really interested in testing our existing strategies and plans against these possible futures. So we really wanted to get a range of futures, and the random nature of the game did seem to give us that. I would say the one flaw was that, in fact, perhaps some of them, even though people felt that they were very scary, weren't quite scary enough, because the nature of spinning the wheel for a single year only gives you one event a year, and as we know, you can have multiple events in the 1 year. So that's something to keep working on. So then the next step was to then use these scenarios to test some of our existing frameworks, and we're very lucky to have our colleagues from Parks Victoria helping us with the development of this workshop, so that we could test we could use the scenarios to test some existing frameworks through the Conservation Action Plan for the Grampians of Garrawerd National Park. So we still, in the world of conservation and catchment management, have a lot of objectives that focus on improving or maintaining the existing condition or function of our ecological systems, and we're becoming increasingly aware that this may not in fact be possible. So to be able to test those and ask those questions under these scenarios, would we still be able to maintain this condition or this function, is a very interesting and important conversations to be had. And Parks Victoria had been working with this RAD framework as well. So I won't go into that today, but essentially it's there to sort of speak to how important it is to them use the scenarios to ask these questions and to explore how we can bring these different tools together to answer these questions in the conservation of in the context of conservation. So it's incredibly important, because the feedback from the day was that even though the scenarios, even though it was a fun process, the scenarios were depressing, and being able to apply it practically and come up with some practical ideas about how you would change how you manage the system or the species that you're interested in was a really important part of people leaving the day feeling positive and feeling empowered to do something about climate change. And as you can see there, the key thing is that 100% of the participants on the day said that the workshop helped them to improve their understanding of the potential impacts of climate change and the compounding and cascading events, which is what we were all about. So that's all we really have time for. So I just wanted to end by saying thank you so much to my colleagues who helped on the day, and to my friends and colleagues from Parks Victoria, Genevieve, Phil, Matthew, Sarah and Mark, and also to the NESP people who came and helped with the workshop as well. Tim, Helen, Nick and Ramona, thank you so much. We couldn't have done it without you, and I can't thank you enough.
No. Thanks, Marty. That was a great, very brief overview. So thank you for that. And I think that's a really great outcome, that you had, all the participants saying that the day helped improve their understanding, because like you said, that's really what we were trying to achieve. And so, yeah, it's great to see that result there. Thanks, Marty. We'll have you back for the questions. So I'll just put remind everyone to please put your questions in the Q&A, and we'll move on to our next speaker. So for our final case study, I would like to welcome Dr. Malcolm Johnson, who is Environmental Sustainability Manager at the Huonville Council in Tasmania. So I'll hand over to you now, Malcolm. Thank you very much. Let me know when you need to change slides.
Great, thanks, Ramona, and thanks for letting me talk. I first want to start by acknowledging that I'm calling in from the lands of the Malekadi and Lillikwani people of the Southeast Nation down here in Huon Valley. Huon Valley Council is the southernmost council in all of Australia, and we are a rural regional council, so we have some very different relationships with climate change and climate adaptation down this way. Also want to acknowledge my colleague, Dr. Sherilyn Anderson, our principal climate change here, dedicated to climate change work at Huon Valley Council, who was integral to the delivery of this workshop, as well as the local consulting group Wild Built, who helped us make sure that we could deliver this. We were brought in pretty late in the timing of the project, so we only had a few weeks to do our co-design and delivery. But despite that short turnover, I think what we delivered and the experiences we had, as well as the experiences of the participants, was quite astounding. To sort of give a bigger picture though, Huon Valley has been in a big transition to focus on livability and the importance of delivering a livable future for our community members. What that means is that we've adopted a framework that I'll talk more at the end of this of my slides, but it also means that we're trying to find ways to integrate things like climate change into everything that we do at Council. So this workshop was great for that. Next slide. So our co-design process was sort of all over the place, albeit quite quickly. We had the folks from NESP really providing lots of data, lots of science, and lots of information for us to draw from. The core thing that we wanted to differentiate with our workshop was we wanted to get far away from the focus on hazards. I think lots of councils really focus on how do we prepare, respond, build resilience, and recover from hazards and disasters. It was some of the more unpredictable components of climate change and climate impacts that we were really wanting to interrogate. So part of our co-design process, we developed a lot of resources. On one side of this page, you sort of see a set of weather, climate impacts, hazard information, and livability systems. These were prompting cards for the community and participants to sort of look at and draw from, identifying aspects and questions that could help spark ideas while they were in the workshop. And then on the right-hand side, like the other two case studies, we introduced, be it wild cards or those more unpredictable components of climate change, which we called variable events. So each table during the workshop sat down and had this variable event presented to them and said, everything you do, imagine this climate future through these variable events. And what that led to was thinking outside of the box when it came to climate change and really saying, well, what happens if Huon Valley has this massive population surge or are fully disconnected from the internet? What would we do in a climate hazard, disaster, or any aspect of climate change to that end? Next slide. The workshop itself was structured where we invited both council staff and community members. We had around equal parts of both sides. We, through the co-design process, decided to actually separate and have council staff sitting with council staff and community sitting with community. Our thinking was potentially we could compare and contrast the outputs of each table and see if there were differences. Was the community thinking differently than what the staff was thinking? During the day, it was probably a 3/4 day workshop. We sort of started by presenting the facts of climate change and saying there's no questions asked here. This is what we're expecting in the future based on the science we got from NESP. And then we worked through a series of activities from asking the community to identify the components of Huon Valley that they value, then talking about impacts over time. We used sort of a visioning experience where we said, well, imagine you are 10, 20, 50 years into the future and use a series of time points to sort of build through each activity. So identify, in the first case, identifying impacts over 3 different time periods of increasing severity of climate change. Next slide. So I'll sort of quickly touch on the 3 components that came out of our workshop. So the first one were these impact outputs. I think this is very similar to what the other case studies identified, was really looking at what sort of impacts do we see. Next, in the 2030 timeframe, the community and the council staff really identified very similar risks and impacts from climate change. So infrastructure damage, flooding, housing loss, mental health crisis, all of these things are quite known. Next. Then as we built into 2050, you start to see much more serious climate impacts sort of being envisioned for the future. So food production loss, economic disruption, civil unrest. And then finally, in the 2070 time period, we sort of see the use of these really extreme terms: government collapse, system collapse, climate refugees. And I think when working through the activity this way, like the other case study showed, like you do see the seriousness that people are experiencing as they think through, well, what does 2070 look like when you assume that high emission scenario? Next slide. And then I'll ask Roma to quickly click through these a little bit. So when we moved into the next phase, we did want to talk about adaptation. We didn't want to leave sort of the impacts as the final point of our workshop. So we sort of prompted the participants to sort of think through, what can we actually do here in Huon Valley within our sphere of control, within our spheres of influence and concern, to respond to those 3 time periods of impacts. Impressively enough, 90 or I think 80% of the comments on adaptation actually fell in that sphere of control. But then as you move out, you can sort of see there's a lot of work for council to do, a lot of work for our community to do, to really say, okay, how do we build mutual aid? How do we establish more circular economy? How do we engage youth better? Was really spawning from this. And then in the last sphere of concern, only a few components of things that we really need to be paying attention to as council, because there is so much that we can do to adapt within that sphere of control. Next one. After those 2 activities, we sort of then had a reset, had a nice bit of food, and sat down and asked all of the participants to then write stories. We gave them sheets of paper that has some prompts, here's how you write a story based on those impacts and those adaptations. Envision yourself as one of these people and age groups, and describe and write a story about how you experienced a climate-induced disaster or hazard in the future. And what we saw is there's so much overlap between all of these stories about what a adapted future looks like in the case of climate change, but still all really structured around that reality of what real impacts are. Next slide. And to sort of finally finish, the way that I think for me, the biggest learnings from this was really not leaving the impacts as the only thing that we talked about. I think, as other folks said, climate change and talking about extreme impacts in 2070, 2100 futures are very, very depressing. We've done a lot of work here at Council through our BCOM initiative to sort of inform how we think and feel with climate change and live in a world with climate change. But again, we then have brought so much of that back into our livability framework, the new way that we're working at Council. And there's so many, we're still really diving into all of the content from the workshops and how we're integrating that into everything that we're doing, from budgeting to planning to land use planning. So there's so much more I could say, but I'll probably just end it there. Thanks.
Thanks, Malcolm. That was really great. And I think it was really interesting to see how you put the future risk into context for your community with those personas. It was really, really great to see. Well, got lots of claps, so thank you. Thanks all the audience reactions. So it's now time for our Q&A session. So hopefully you've been putting your questions in the Q&A section of the webinar. If you have any questions, please put them in there, and we will work through them, and I'll ask the participants. I'll stop sharing the slides now, and I'd ask that all the speakers come into view so we can see you all. There's Malcolm, great. Marty and Shireen, thank you. Welcome, everyone. Firstly, I'd like to start with a question of mine, because I know, I would be really interested if you could all tell us what the greatest benefit of this process has been for your organisation. Shireen, would you like to start, and we can go around to Malcolm and Marty?
Yeah, thank you, Ramona. And before I provide an answer to your specific question, I thought I'll start with, why I think climate narrative scenarios or such scenario planning is important, especially in, our work with policy development. I was just reflecting, and it's, years ago we were talking about complexity, change, and world becoming more complicated. But right now, disruptions are a new norm. And what does that mean in our work, especially in policy development, is, it means being better prepared for the future, because the changes that are coming our way is simply not an option anymore. So, the scenario planning, it's one of the tools that helps you make better decisions today. I believe that while you cannot predict the future, but by exploring all these alternative scenarios and by expanding our understanding of what is possible, we are better equipped to envision and prepare for the future. And that's very important for especially in policy development. And it's not about scenario planning is not about getting the future perfect. It is about a level of readiness, being able to respond when that happens, so that you're less shocked. Now coming to the ACT, because we did systems thinking approach for this project, it was very valuable, particularly because it brought a lot of stakeholders across the government together, and it had dual outputs and a lot of other benefits as well. First one is because we were able to collaboratively, together develop the scenarios. Secondly, and most importantly, because you've gone through that process, we had 5 major engagements, including 3 co-design workshops. we were able to map interdependencies between all these interconnected systems, and that would actually help us identify our shared vulnerabilities and therefore opportunities for more integrated, approaches. And in addition to that, because you had all the stakeholders go through this process, you were building their capacity in terms of, scenario development and foresight planning, which is very important. And to keep the momentum going, we had very recently did a systems mapping. We did a mini version of the scenario planning with regard to water management in the ACT, where again it was a cross-sectoral workshop where we had all the key stakeholders in the water management landscape in the ACT, including people from drinking water suppliers to stormwater management, infrastructure developers, urban planners, city service providers. So together, we did a systems mapping for the water system in the ACT, to explore future challenges and opportunities that are linked to climate change and variability, and including looking at risks that could cascade and compound across the system. And we were able to test um, our system in terms of two scenarios. One where you have very increasing water scarcity because of reducing annual rainfall, and another scenario where we might have abundance of water because when you have rain, it's going to be more intense, and potentially both scenarios playing or happening in the same season or in the same year. So together, when you do this sort of scenario planning together, you are able to come up with a list of potential actions that could be can be list of actions for further consideration based on urgency and importance, and therefore it actually provides you opportunity to come up with solutions to address the integrated challenges that you have. Yeah, thank you, Ramon.
Wow, that sounds very impressive, Shireen. And it seems to be, all these government departments that are usually quite siloed and separated, bringing together all on the same page and building those relationships and really understanding how they need to work together through these challenges. I think that's, that is a really great example. Thank you for sharing. Marty or Malcolm, did you have also wanted to share some of the benefits of the project? Malcolm, go first.
Sure. Yeah, Marty threw it at me. Yeah, I think the main benefit internally for council, since we had staff and community, was I think it actually opened the eyes to a lot of our staff who have pretty good knowledge of climate change, sound knowledge. They understand that it will change the way that we work, but I think it really opened their eyes to like how intense things might change into the future and how we can't wait to start adapting, that adaptation is sort of an immediate action and has to be driven through council to some degree, to a large degree. Obviously, as a council, we're trying to facilitate community to do a lot of this as well, but I think it really puts a lot of onus on our staff. I think for the community, there were a lot of people who didn't realize how critical social connection was until they got to that last step of writing the stories. Generally speaking, we had one participant say, "Oh, I moved to Huon Valley, so I never had to talk to my neighbors," which is a story of rural regional places all over Australia. But then at the end, he was like, "Oh, maybe I do actually need to know my neighbor a little bit better," right? There was that recognition of, oh, isolation isn't an option in a climate change future. And I think that alone, those two pushes alone, a little bit on the staff and a little bit on the community, is sort of, for me, the win that we were hoping for with this workshop.
Yeah, that's a great example. Thanks, Malcolm.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. But I think for the CMA, because our context was really far more internal and with our immediate stakeholders around making or testing our current plans and actions for biodiversity. It was the same, but but it was at that smaller scale. And for us, yes, a lot of people. Yeah, no skeptics, a lot of people who know the science, and are behind a lot of scientists. But for us, the real benefit was that the involvement of NESP and the knowledge brokers gave us the time and the space to have a conversation together that we just don't get. And yeah.
Thank you, Marty. That's great. Thank you. We do have some questions coming through now. So the first question is for Shireen. Could the method you have outlined be applied to people with limited awareness of climate projections?
Thank you. That's a great question. And the reason why we are doing climate narrative scenario is to, it's for such issues where people, it's very hard for people to, when you talk from climate projection perspective, if you say there's going to be more number of, days over 35 degrees, what does that mean? It really doesn't make much sense. The numbers doesn't really make sense. So therefore, these narrative approaches are done so that people are able to relate to the risks that's coming their way. And this is what our narrative scenarios are trying to do. For example, in the scenario, we are providing some hypothetical scenarios. For example, in January 2034, because of they are over 16 days with temperature soaring more than 41 degrees, and by the 8th day there's going to be a bushfire in New South Wales South Coast. And so in next couple of days the smoke's going to reach ACT or Canberra, and and the impact of these smoke and heat across the ACT. What does that, what does your health system look like? What does that mean to your infrastructure? And so being able to provide that narrative across all these different systems that we looked at, the 7 key systems in the ACT, it actually helps people understand climate risks or climate science more. Yeah, so it's really for such climate risk awareness.
Yeah, so that's the real benefit of having the narrative scenarios, really, isn't it? Putting it in their context and adding their local knowledge and local context into what the impacts are, from the climate hazards that we're seeing. Yes. Thanks, Shireen. Did anyone have any other things they wanted to add to that? Malcolm or Marty, did you want to add to that question at all? No? We do have a...
Just agree with everything Shireen said. Yeah, absolutely. It's key and just make it real for people and have that conversation about what it really means.
Yeah, maybe I'll echo that in that, like at council, we've previously been given sort of a Word doc that says, here's how you make climate change decisions. And it's just a giant table with thousands of numbers on it, which for many of us means nothing. Even for our engineers, doesn't mean a lot. Whereas these narrative scenarios, when you're reading through them, and especially when you're participating in them, right, to be a participant, I think all of us who are here were part of those workshops. So we felt, what was happening in the room, the way that people were thinking, the way that they were feeling as those timelines, as those impacts grew and compounded and cascaded on each other. It's like, well, you start to have that sense that, a table of numbers saying, oh, in 2100, it's going to rise this degrees and sea level rose X much larger, just doesn't touch you in any way.
And even if you weren't going to be talking about climate change and the increased intensity and frequency in and of itself, it would still be useful to say, well, we had this event last year and that event 2 years before. What if they happened in the same year? What if they happened in the same month? So for compounding, cascading impacts, it's a really important conversation, even without the added influence of warming climate. So.
Yeah, thank you. Malcolm, there's a question for you as well about the stories at the end of your presentation, which centred around social capital and connectedness, but they did not seem to have a core theme in the word cloud graphics. Someone's analysing your slides very carefully. Can you comment on that, or did you notice that as well?
Yeah, I think absolutely that is correct, is the quick answer to that statement. But I think that was something that came to us after the fact, when we have finally sat down and looked at all of the outputs, was doing that sort of 3 components of drawing the impacts and listing, what adaptations are, and then having them write the stories. Each one produced something very, very different and very unique. But it was those stories at the end that I think because you're trying to imagine yourself as someone in the future, you get to sort of say, well, what would I do if I was in that situation? And it always comes back to, like, we know this at council, when it comes to a disaster, the people you know, the connections you have, that, you know, the social capital, social infrastructure is just essential to be more prepared, to recover faster, to feel resilient, which, you know, when you look at impacts, it's hard to really tease that out other than saying, oh, well, there might be social breakdown or society collapse, as in that 2071 on that third slide. But it doesn't play out until you have the chance to sort of say, well, who would I be if I was in that future? So I would definitely recommend, I think, you know, all of the different activities across all of these projects are worth doing. Like, I think they should all be done, all of them, and just see what comes out, because all of those different components just lead to different threads. And I think there's questions about where do we go from here. And, you know, there's an infinite number of opportunities for us, from writing up to integrating into existing plans to distributing it back out to community to running the same workshop again with different staff. Because I think it needs to be, everyone at council needs to play this. Everyone probably at ACT and the CMA probably should sit in these workshops, because there is such a benefit to have to think differently about the future than we normally do when we're just trying to plan for climate change.
That's a great point, Malcolm. And I think, you know, there's another question here as well that said, you know, in a council setting, who were the most important people that you had to have in the room? But I think you just kind of said, answered that in a way and said everyone, it's important for everyone to hear that, and to talk through it. Yes, great. There's probably time. There's a question here that I think would be good for each of you to answer, which is about how are you going with integrating these? Because one of the key points that we made was that, you know, it's important to integrate it into frameworks and integrate it to existing policy. So how are you going with integrating these risk scenarios and priorities in your organisational strategies and your climate-related risk management frameworks at the moment? Like, how have you been going, and what are your plans for the future? Good. Anyone keen to start? Yeah. Thank you, Shereen.
Happy to start that. So, well, yes, we in the ACT would like to continue our work on scenario development. We would like to continue to look at compounding and cascading risk, because this is a key tool that can help us look at cross-cutting risk. You know, one of our work stream in our team is climate ready government, where we are basically trying to integrate climate risk considerations into government decision making. And within that work stream, our intention is to work closely with ACT Insurance Authority, which is, you know, who is the, you know, they have the ACT's risk policy honors. So we would like to work closely with ACTIA to, you know, try to embed climate risk considerations into the organization's BAU, business as usual risk management processes. And this scenario planning is one of the key tools to do that. We would like to run, as Malcolm mentioned, we would like to run this, you know, scenario workshops so that people are able to look at all this compounding cascading impacts that doesn't necessarily get captured by, you know, climate modeling. So we are definitely going to continue this work. And as a part of this, the project itself, we were able to document, you know, how we did the scenario development. So we actually have a project report to capture all the steps that we have taken. And, you know, if in case if you need to do this again, what are lessons learned that we would like to do things differently, and that's all done. And I think that's going to be a useful resource going forward. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Shireen. Marty or Malcolm, do you want to share yours?
We've never had any intention of using the scenarios in and of themselves as a finished product. It's the process of developing the scenarios that we're interested in progressing and integrating into our future planning. And the CMAs, all the Victorian CMAs have a regional, have a statewide forum, and through that and through support of the Victorian government Water Division, we've been looking at developing adaptation pathways for some of our key areas, estuaries, species, you know, at a lot of different levels to try and learn more from the adaptation pathways process. So our next step and our next way of integrating the narrative scenarios development is in bringing that into the adaptation pathways process to use it as a way of as a first step, I think, as in opening people's minds up to the possible scenarios and to the impacts. One of the things that, you know, the game and the development of narrative scenarios does is it allows you to explore the extremes and the unexpected combinations of events, which the projections alone just don't do. And so, yeah, that's our next step, is seeing how we can use it to further those conversations about the relevance of our existing projects, and then as we move into our next phase of developing a new regional catchment strategies and the like, that's a couple of years off. So, which is good because it gives us a couple of years to sort of learn more about these processes and try to bring these things together, because a lot of it's done. A lot of the risk planning is done based on single events, not on the on the cascading and compounding. And so, yeah, there's still a lot of conversations to be had, and there's still a lot of time and space to be found to continue having these conversations.
Thanks, Marty. Malcolm, did you want to add? We've got a couple of minutes left if you wanted to add something.
Yeah, absolutely. I think very similar to Marty, for us, this is just another tool in our toolbox on how to sort of engage and increase understanding, awareness, and, you know, connection to climate change. Because a lot of the, you know, from my perspective, a lot of the inaction comes from just not having any sort of connection to climate change. You can know all of the facts, but if it doesn't influence you, make you feel something, you're not going to change the way that you work every day. So for us, the workshop itself is just another tool. We've got several in our toolbox now, and if we had a little more time at council, we would be running those tools all the time across every single staff member, which is sort of our plan in the next few years. When it comes to risk register components and how we actually integrate and action those risks through the more statutory side of things, the outputs themselves are now being used as a way that we sort of look at and assess what we're doing at council. So with the livability framework, we have, I would say, 16 attributes that are now sort of our core KPIs for council. How do we maintain or increase the livability across those attributes? One of the acknowledgements we have is, well, most of those attributes are under threat from climate change, which is something that, you know, unfortunately is quite out of our sphere of control to stop. But if we have lots within that sphere of control to adapt to, again, that you saw that in that word cloud, there's so much that we can do. And so there's a thinking now when we have a climate risk, which we have several within our risk register, well, we now have a massive set of potential projects, responses, actions that we can be sort of investigating, spending time on, and bringing into the way that we work. And for the community, like, there's just so much information from this that is like inspired the way that we can be working. And now whenever I talk about climate change, I draw from this workshop and say, oh, well, this reminds me of this specific thing that a community member said. And I think that tends to be where, like, that's how you integrate this into risk. It's not just putting it into a database that someone assesses every so often. It's actually changing the way that people react to climate change. That's really going to get us to get these narratives and get that climate future into the ways that we work.
Thanks, Malcolm. It's great. Well, we've run out of time for questions, but thank you, everyone. Thank you very much to all the presenters today. Thank you to everyone online for all your great participation, all the questions that we've got. Sorry if we didn't get to them all. I wanted to say, if you wanted to know more, you can read the reports. They're now published on the Hub website, so we'll be sharing the link to that with you as well. We'd really like to thank you for your support of the Hub webinars. We hope you've enjoyed today's. We have some great webinars coming up next year, so please subscribe to our newsletter and keep an eye on your inbox for more information, and spread the word about to anyone working in this space. We'll also be sending you a feedback form, and we appreciate your feedback with the link to the recording when it's published, and it'll be on the Climate Systems Hub website as well. So thank you again to all the presenters and for those behind the scenes for making this all happen. We really hope you have a lovely Christmas, and we'll see you all next time at our webinars starting in early 2026. Thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of your day.